Alright, so in this video, making to cover the fungi chapter, chapter 31. So fungi is a huge, right, it's a domain, one of the 4 domains. And they don't really talk too much in this textbook about the 4 domains when we get to this point, because they're changing the way they're grouping organisms. Hopefully I won't have to make any changes to my PowerPoint. So mushroom, of course, is a fungi, okay? And we'll talk about the 4 main groups of mushrooms, right? They absorb nutrients. You think of them as the decomposers, right? They're very diverse. There's 100,000 different species, right? You know, they can be yeast that causes yeast infections in human beings. They can make beer, right? They can be mushrooms. So we'll talk about some of the categories. Fungi are considered heterotrophs. Okay, they have to absorb nutrients like we do. They can't make their own food, is another way of putting it. Fungi use enzymes to break stuff down. It's very important that fungi break things down, or if they didn't decompose stuff, right, it would just last forever, right? And that wouldn't be good at this point as long as we've been around. If everything that was alive didn't decompose, it'd be miles deep by now. So if they're decomposers, they break down, they can be parasitic, they absorb nutrients from living hosts, right? We'll talk about it. Mutualistic means that they share, right, with another, they have a commensal relationship, you know, with another organism. And they both reciprocate, they both benefit when that happens. So we'll give you some examples, like lichens are an example of that. So the body structure, you know, they can be single cell. That means they don't really have any type of body, they're just cells. And then they can even form what's called multicellular filaments, but they're not like the classic cell that we've talked about in Bio 1, right? They're a little different. So don't worry too much about the differences. So they can form, like, see, this is actually they call it a fruiting body. It's the reproductive structure. Most of the fungus, when you see a mushroom like that on the surface, is most of the body of the fungus is below the surface in the soil. They call that hyphae, or mycelium is another term used. They have a tubular cell wall strength, right? And they have chitin inside them, like insects do too. All right, but that's right. If you want to watch this animation, it's in the content section. If you have any trouble watching videos, call the online help desk. I can't help you. So most fungi are divided by septa if they are considered multicellular, right? Concentric, lack septa. So some of them have it, some of them don't. You know, the mycelium is interwoven mass of hyphae. So if I've got things folded like this, you should recognize, right, what a fungal hyphae is, right? And it's made of mycelium, that kind of thing. So this is an example of a worm here, right, a nematode, and it looks like C. elegans. And then this is the fungal hyphae coming up and attacking. So you know, a fungus isn't a plant. It's not, you know, an animal, but it's acting like an animal by eating this nematode. And they're showing how, if they get into a plant, how they can get, if these little hyphae go into the cells, and they can absorb the nutrients from the cell. Right? That's how that works. Now, they can be sexual and they can be asexual, right? Sexual means you have sex, you make, you know, gametes. So they make the weirdest gametes there are, okay? They have this, like, even they say this guy, right, has an asexual reproduction as well as a sexual reproduction mechanism. They can do both. Now, don't worry about the haploid, diploid states and all the details in this. You know, they can produce spores, and they produce them through mitosis, okay? A fungal nuclei is normally haploid, right? That doesn't mean it's always, just most of the time. If I said fungal nuclei are always haploid, that would be false. All right, so fungal, they make pheromones. So hours and even days or centuries can pass before the occurrence of karyogamy occurs, right? And that's when haploid nuclei fuse to produce diploid. So the difference between haploid and haploid has one set of chromosomes. When it becomes diploid, then you double up. You have two sets of all the chromosomes, okay? So in animals, like with us, you get a copy of mom's and you get a copy of dad's. Well, there's no mom and dad for fungi, but they have, right, to get to the diploid state, two haploid nuclei, right, come together. It's short-lived. They do have asexual reproduction, so, you know, sometimes a certain fungi may only reproduce asexually, right? There's many different fungi, 100,000 different fungi, you know, so they're not all doing it the same way. So we're just trying to generalize through this chapter, give you a rough idea. Like, for instance, molds produce haploid spores. That's their reproductive mechanism, right? That's why that fungi make spores like this, is to reproduce. Now, a yeast cell, they use just sexual division, or what's called budding. So a bud comes out of a yeast, and that becomes another yeast. So they call that, you know, a cell division. It's a little bit different than making spores. Okay, but this would be asexual. Yeast can only asexually reproduce by budding. You should remember that, it's both. Some have no sexual stage. My colleagues have truly called these the deuteromyces. Right, so these fungi are reclassified. Nothing to say about that. So fungi are thought to have originated from what they refer to as an aquatic, meaning that it was in the ocean, that it was flagellated protist. Okay, before the protists were probably even became protists, or one of them, right? That the animals and fungi are more closely related to each other. They're more like, because they're heterotrophs, right? They can't make their own food. So plants do, you know, as well as a lot of the protists are able to, say, photosynthesize. So that's, you know, if you can photosynthesize, you're more like a plant than anything else. So the first, the unicellular flagellated, that we don't know what that organism was, but it probably, right, eventually became what are referred to as the animals now. They became multicellular. And then before you made the fungi, you had these what are called nuclear chlorids, right? So you refer to animals and fungi, they belong to this group or clade called opisthokonts. Opisthokonts, I don't know how to say a lot of these words. And they originated from a protozoan or unicellular flagellated ancestor. So DNA evidence, fungi are most closely related to the nuclear chlorids. Animals are most closely related to unicellular protists called cyanoflagellates. Okay, nothing really to say here. This is just multicellular polarity, right? Fungus became multicellular. animals originated from single-cell organisms that became multicellular, but they're saying they arose separately between animals and fungi, right? Because fungi really, they're not the classic sense of multicellular organisms like animals are. We'll get into the animals and what multicellular is in a later chapter. So the fungi were among the earliest colonizers, so they moved from, right, they had the if they had a flagella then, right, unicellular flagella, then they were in water. They eventually colonized land. That means they went from being aquatic to surviving on land. Sim genes were likely present. So fungi have radiated, right, so this would be the unicellular flagellated guy who was here, and it became what are called clarids, triads, I guess is the better word for it. They have flagella, and these are fungi. The zygomyces, Plumerimyces, Ascomyces, and Blastidiomyces. These are the four main groups of the fungi. And we'll talk about those four in this chapter. So you should probably know examples and stuff like that. Okay. So clytrids, or the phyla Clytotraumata, right? They belong to, like, these are the four main categories. I guess that would make it the fifth, but it's not your classic fungus. So zoospore, associate that with either this phylum, and like clytrids is the common name. All of the fungi end in mycota when you talk about the phylum, right? Zygomycota, or zygomyces is another way. Right? This is probably singular, that might be plural. Zygomyces include fast-growing molds, the bread mold Rhizopus, right? When you see that growing in bread, right? Now you know what to call it when you see it instead of just calling it mold. And don't worry about, right? It has an asexual reproduction and a sexual reproduction. It can do either way, and it is very complicated, right? So I don't think it's necessary for us to get into all the details. Ascomyces, or Ascomycota, right, or marine freshwater, right? They could be, basically land and water. That's another way of thinking of it. They form the fruiting bodies called ascocarps. And then remember, Saccharomyces and Candida belong to this group. Neurospora carassa, the common bread mold, was a model organism. That means when they were sequencing DNA, right, this was one of the organisms of the fungi that they wanted to sequence first, right? Because model organism just means it's been studied extensively. There's a lot of studying on it. So Blastidiomycota, or Blastomyces, they form what's called a blastidium. These puffballs, right? That's their fruiting body, I guess you could say. And they look. There's all sorts of different looks to them. They don't always look the same. They are plant parasites. If you see this, right, that means a spore developed in the middle, and then it grew. It's underground. You see a bunch of these fungal filaments, and then they get to a certain point, and then they pop up, and then these are going to release the spores to generate more fungus, right? So the mushroom itself is a fruiting body that releases the spores. But the one spore made this one huge fungal filament element so underneath the soil or the surface is where most of this fungus is growing. So these are called blastidiocarps, a mushroom is. Okay, so they can be both decomposers, mutualists, and some are pathogens, right? They can eat plants, and they can cause, a plant can get a fungal infection and die from it. They're efficient decomposers. Without them, we would be in big trouble, to say the least. Mutualistic relationships with plants and animals. Mutualistic absorb nutrients from the host organism, and reciprocate, that means they help the host in some manner. So, right, those are toxins that help. Lichen is a good example. It's a fungus plus a photosynthetic microorganism. So it just depends on what this photosynthetic microorganism is and what type of lichen it is. But there's an algae cell, and then the fungal hyphae interact with the green is the algae, right? And then the fungus, they work together and they form what are called a lichen. So a lichen is actually two organisms. It looks like a plant, and fungus can be parasites. You make LSD from fungus, right, that grow on rye, in case you're wondering where LSD came from. And Saccharomyces is another model organism. It's a yeast. They can cause fungal infections.